As Pakistan's army intensifies its offensive against the Taliban, we ask whether it really is committed to the fight and if it's properly prepared for counter-insurgency. And in a country long run by the generals, how much control does this army have over the future of Pakistan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Lauren Taylor. Hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing from fighting in Pakistan's northwest frontier province. The Pakistani army's latest assault on the Taliban has expanded beyond the Swat Valley into neighbouring provinces. The military claims it has killed more than 700 Taliban fighters in the latest clashes. And though there aren't any official numbers for civilian casualties, the action has already resulted in around 350,000 people becoming refugees in their own country. Now reports suggest the army plans to start a new offensive in the tribal areas of Waziristan. And as Bethan Howe tells us, it's not new for the military to have a hand in Pakistani political affairs.
Pakistan's army has been intrinsically linked with the country's politics for more than half a century. In 1958, the army was granted power by the president and controlled Pakistan for the next 13 years. In the early 70s, Pakistan was embroiled in a civil war and a conflict with India. They resulted in independence for Bangladesh, and the army was forced out of its political role. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was elected as president of Pakistan and brought in a new constitution. Bhutto was deposed in 1977 after riots followed his re-election. Army Chief of Staff General Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq took over and declared martial law. General Zia was killed in a plane crash in 1988. Civilian leadership was restored after his death, when Benazir Bhutto was elected Prime Minister. Democratic rule continued until a bloodless coup in 1999. In 2001, General Pervez Musharraf became President of Pakistan. He relinquished his army position in 2007, but was forced to resign the following year. The current leadership is in the hands of democratically elected Asif Ali Zardari, but the military are still seen as a counterbalance to the government. And Musharraf's successor, General Kayani, is considered to be a highly powerful figure.
Well, joining us now are our guests. In Islamabad, Maria Sultan. She's the director of the South Asian Strategic Stability Institute. In London, Salman Ahmed. He's a journalist specialising in Pakistani affairs. And in Montreal, Julian Schofield. He's a professor of political science at Concordia University and author of numerous books on Pakistani military affairs. Julian Schofield, just on the history side of it, you would know that the background of it. Why this military offensive now? Was it out of a sense of embarrassment, or due to the fact that embarrassment at the fact that the Taliban were taking over areas, or was it more to do with US pressure?
Well, the much broader historical dilemma was that at partition, at the foundation of Pakistan, the northwest frontier province was actually pro-India. The primary mullah in the region, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, was pro-Mahatma Gandhi and had good relations with Nehru and didn't want to join Pakistan. And it was a very close-run thing. It was possible then that Pakistan could have been formed without a northwest frontier province. The mood changed during partition when Sardar Ibrahim, another mullah, came with the stories of the massacres, particularly by the RSS, the Sikh extremist groups, as the Muslims were crossing from India into Pakistan, and that changed the mood of the region. But the Pakistan military has always been very sensitive and aware of the potential for separatism in the region. So the dilemma is not to push too hard when they deal with autonomous movements in the region.
Salman Ahmed,
the early 50s, 51, 52.
If I could just bring in one of the other guests, Salman Ahmed, how do you see this? Why the action of the military at this stage in such a dramatic way?
Well, you see, the Pakistani government's been blamed for quite a while for not tackling the militancy effectively. And when the Prime Minister, Yusuf Gilani, went to Washington on his first prime ministerial trip, he was shown some evidence by former CIA Director Michael Hayden that the Pakistani military is complicit with Taliban militants. And this was evidence which we do not know what evidence it was, but we know that it was evidence good enough that he couldn't refute. Now, what we are seeing now is that just when Obama was meeting Zardari and Karzai, we have this military offensive, which essentially is Pakistani military taking a very heavy-handed approach to tackling militants who do not really have a base. So if you are going to use or employ heavy artillery to shell civilian areas, these militants are very easily going to move on.
Okay.
And
let me just put that
I don't
point
see how effective the strategy will be towards tackling terrorism or militancy.
All right, Maria Sultan, let me put that point to you. Is that a question? Can they actually deal with the militants with a kind of traditional military establishment that they're using?
I think it's a very complex problem, and we need to see it in that context, because when you're dealing with the situation and to the question as to why they have gone ahead and carrying out this operation specifically at this time, we need to put in context the fact that they try to give negotiations a chance and also try to bring legitimacy to the government and to the demands of the people for that area, that is by bringing the Nizam-e-Adl factor. That kind of gave them a small window of opportunity when the militants changed their goalpost from actually implementing Nizam-e-Adl to perhaps a broader role in the administrative hold of Pakistan. And this is the time I think the military thought that perhaps they have been able to bring about a difference between the masses who had empathy for these militants and also the political viewpoint which said that perhaps you need to go for negotiations. And I think what they have tried to do is that have gone for a heavy-headed approach, essentially so that they could take out any kind of bases there and ensure that it doesn't become a stronghold.
Okay.
And it is not some operation which has just been done like that, because they have done considerable work in terms of looking after for some people in the internally displaced people.
Okay. Just staying on the military issues, Julian Schofield, the Pakistani Prime Minister described the military offensive against the Taliban as a war for the country's survival. Is it as critical as that?
No, it's not critical. The Taliban is really a regional influence. They don't have much reach into the Punjab. About 10% of the Taliban are Punjabis, but there are separate political bases in the Punjab that would make it very difficult for the Taliban to penetrate. First and foremost is the very strong Barelvi congregations who've been more or less suppressing the Deobandi movements into the mosques. So it's really an exaggeration. Most of this is driven...
So do you think that this military operation is for show?
Definitely a show. Swat has no strategic value. Brunner does, because it's much closer to the Tarbela Dam. But the Pakistani army is already engaged more or less successfully in Mahmand and Bajaur in the northwest frontier province. Whether Swat was in the hands of the Taliban or not, is largely irrelevant to the strategic fate of Pakistan. The lesson the Pakistani army is applying today is a lesson of the 1960s, which is that as long as the regions are not separatist, and Fazlullah from the Swat and Baitullah Masood, none of them are separatists. As long as they're not separatists, they contribute to the security of Pakistan by keeping out the Afghans. And we have forgotten, but Pakistan, before it reached into Afghanistan, in the 50s and 60s, it was the Afghans who were sending across infiltrators from their military and from the tribals to try to instigate an autonomous movement.
Okay,
whether Pakistan wins or loses in Swat will have no impact.
Okay, Salman Ahmed, would you agree that the military offensive at the moment is simply for show, as Mr. Schofield was suggesting?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's for sure, but it's definitely not a fight for survival, as the Prime Minister's put it. I think that's going a bit too far. Pakistan is a very moderate country. It does not bode well for views which the Taliban hold. I do not think for a second that the Taliban can go and invade or take over even parts of Pakistan's major cities such as Islamabad, Karachi or Lahore. It is a problem which is being blown out of proportion. It is a very regional issue, I agree with Julian. It is something which local people say that the Pakistani military can crush at any given time. Now the matter is why they haven't managed to crush them is a question we need to ask.
Okay. Maria Sultan, why hasn't the military been able to crush them? And let me just quote you an article from the Asian Human Rights Commission. The Pakistan army is reluctant to fight with the Taliban as they were nurtured and trained by its intelligence agency, the ISI. Is that part of the problem here, that they would be fighting against their own?
With all due respect, I think that's outstretching the argument a bit. Perhaps this is something which would have been true maybe 7 years ago, but I think now the situation has changed critically. What we're looking at ground is the fact that yes, it's true, it's a regional religious orthodoxy influence which we're seeing in Pakistan in the case of Taliban. But the fear is because this has gotten linked somehow or the other to the international so-called global war against terror. So the feeling is that perhaps the superstructure of terrorism, which is perhaps in the form of Al-Qaeda, might use these religious orthodox local support elements within and perhaps lead to a basis of further terrorism in Pakistan or a threat of militancy. And I think that's the reason that the military has taken such a strong response to it. They have calculated their action. So it's a pretty calculated move which is right now being conducted. And secondly, it is also for the morale of the people and also trying to dispel this impression that perhaps by fall of Swat or having a kind of this kind of influence which the Taliban were enjoying in Swat, something could be perhaps led into other parts of Pakistan, or chain reaction could have come about. I agree with what Salman has said, that it's not possible, it wouldn't have happened in actuality, but terrorism is of course a psychological thing, and we needed to see in that context.
Okay, well, let's have a quick look at the military establishment, which has always been at the heart of Pakistan's ties with the United States. Military cooperation between the two countries has increased as they both aim to eliminate fighters destabilising both sides of the Afghan-Pakistani border. To this end, the US has provided considerable military aid to Pakistan since 2001. The main hub of the US-Pakistani military cooperation is a base in Torkham, a strategically vital border town next to the Khyber Pass, which is the main supply route for Western forces in Afghanistan. The American-built base is meant to house military personnel from the US, Afghanistan and Pakistan, while stressing that Pakistan's survival against Taliban militants was vital to any US success in Afghanistan. The Obama administration pressed Pakistan's President Asif Ali Zardari to do more against the militants who alarmed the US and its allies after their recent incursion into Bunair, a key region just 60 miles, 100 kilometres roughly from Islamabad. Obama has even pledged $400 million in emergency economic assistance to help Pakistan combat the insurgency within its borders. But the threat to Afghanistan's stability is not the only one. The US says it's increasingly concerned that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal may be at risk of falling into the hands of the militants either during its transport or by the infiltration of atomic laboratories or fuel production plants. The Pakistanis insist that the nuclear sites are safe and refuse to reveal their whereabouts. If I could come to you, Julian Schofield, just on the issue of the relationship between Pakistan and the US, does the US trust the Pakistani army?
Well, let me just do a sort of precursor comment that Pakistan's relationship is closer with China than perhaps Saudi Arabia, and perhaps the U.S. is third. So it's not, the U.S. doesn't have a dominating position over the Pakistan Army, although certainly the Pakistan Army welcomes U.S. technology and U.S. funding. I think the relationship between Pakistan and the U.S. is sort of a special historical relationship. Pakistan is regionally the underdog and therefore is very accepting of outside help, even if it doesn't ideologically fit. I mean, this is an Islamic country that has good relations with communist China and has had historically good relations with the capitalist U.S. So Pakistan is very pragmatic, and the military is about the most pragmatic institution. So there's really a technocratic level of trust. The Pakistani military is several standards higher than your typical developing country army. They have a comptroller. They operate from a central budget. They're very good at combined arms operations. They have a long history of working with the UN. So it's an institution the U.S. trusts more than other more politicized institutions or militaries in the region that are coup-proofed or effectively hobbled under the control of intelligence organizations.
Salman Ahmed, I mean, there's been in the past, though, criticism from within the US of the operations of the intelligence agencies, especially the ISI. Is that still an issue for the Americans, do you think?
Well, you see, very recently, upon the application of Sharia law in Swat, which was about a month and a half back, one of the top American generals said that this clearly indicated that the Pakistani military was not helping President Zardari's anti-terrorism policies or was not applying them correctly. where the question of trust comes in. I don't think the trust really is there anymore at the moment, and this is vice versa. The American military does not trust the Pakistani military, and the Pakistani military does not trust the American military, and that is the very reason why the Pakistani military will not give the coordinates or explain to the American military where or how its nuclear weapons are being protected. And this is the very reason why there is so much pressure on the Pakistani military to outline exactly what steps it has taken to protect these nuclear weapons from falling into the hands of militants, terrorists, and this means if the Pakistani military were to declare the exact steps it has taken to protect its nuclear weapons, then perhaps later in the future, and this is how Pakistani generals, military generals think, that there could be surgical strikes towards Pakistan's nuclear weapons, which again is the Pakistani military's trump card, really.
Maria Sultan, that lack of trust between the two sides that was being described just there, we'll just quote to you Richard Holbrooke, who's the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, was giving testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he said in Pakistan, many believe that we're not a reliable long-term partner and that we will abandon them after achieving our counter-terrorism objectives. And many in the US question the dedication of some elements of the Pakistani government to ending safe haven for terrorists on Pakistani soil. Is that one of the problems in terms of any kind of cooperation between the two for a joint effort against the Taliban?
Yeah, before I answer that, I would just like to, just disagree with my colleague Salman over here when he's just said this thing that that's one of the reasons that the Pakistani military has not, for example, shared the nuclear whereabouts. I think it would be very uncanny for any military to ask a military of another organization in another country, and for that matter, a nuclear weapon state to tell the coordinates of the whereabouts. I think that's one of the core aspects of a nuclear weapon state. Pakistan has taken steps, and these steps have not only included coming up like the Non-Proliferation Act of 1998 and 2001 and the export control laws, and a system of almost 8,000 strong security division which has been raised within the Nuclear Secretariat. I think steps have been taken, and in terms of coming back to the question which you asked, whether there is this factor of long-term relationship, yes, that is definitely a factor. That is something which also makes each party come up with the points of convergence, how long that relationship of convergence can go ahead, and most importantly, what would be the limits of that convergence. And that's where you also see shades of divergences between Pakistani interests on this entire issue and US interests. Okay. And I think this is a major factor.
Let me bring in Julian Schofield. I mean, we've seen reports now that in spite of the unpopularity of some of the US drone attacks in Pakistan, there's now a suggestion that the Pakistani military might have some control over where the drones attack. There's sort of reports in today's US media suggesting that they're going to get some kind of a say over where these drone missiles hit. Do you think that's going to, how is that going to play on the ground locally?
Well, it's a return to the past. There's no technical objection in Pakistan to use of drones. They're just objecting to the use of American drones. There's a long history in that region of using Sopwith Camels 100 years ago and then Tempests in the 1940s. These are First and Second World War combat aircraft. And then the use of extrajudicial killings and bombings since then by Pakistan, using Air Force assets to discipline unruly local tribes has been a practice for 100 years since there's been flight on this planet. So certainly Pakistan will have a bigger say. There's a big issue with intelligence sharing. Pakistan, if it has a say, will have access to the American database of targets, and that might be a concern for the Americans. Pakistan does not feel a need and doesn't have share the fear that the Americans have, because the Taliban are the least likely to want to acquire a bomb. The primary American scenario is that somehow the Taliban acquire a nuclear weapon and hand it over to the Iranians. But the very nature of the Pashtun culture is that they're very hostile to the Persians. Okay. Iran would be the last place they'd want to deliver it to. And if I may just conclude, the most likely source, if the most likely source of proliferation from Pakistan is really from the Muhajir community. Urdu speakers like A.Q. Khan and pan-Islamists like Aslam Beg. These are not the Taliban. They're the antithesis of the Taliban. Okay.
Salman Ahmed, if I could just bring you back to the military operation at the moment, the consequences of that in particular. We've had threats issued by the Taliban today to politicians' families. Is there also a danger that their tactics, as they're being squeezed militarily, they could just move their operations elsewhere and start, doing suicide bombings in Islamabad, for instance, or in other places. Is that part of the danger of a big military operation like this?
Well, you do always have that danger there, yes, that they could filter into these bigger cities and there could be terrorist activities there, yes. But the point is that the Taliban are very region specific. So they have always stayed in these tribal areas. They have never really come out, and they've never really come out and settled in big cities. Big cities are very different to what the tribal areas are. The demographics, the culture over there. So if the Taliban were to come into the big cities, they would stand out like a sore thumb, and they wouldn't stand a chance of taking over somewhere like Karachi. So what is actually happening with the Pakistani military offensive at the moment is that they're bombarding all these areas, which are civilian areas, clearly, and more than 1 million people have been displaced. Most of these people tell harrowing tales of how these artillery shells are falling in their houses and their families have been wiped out and their relatives and their friends have died. And what is really happening, and this is what the Pakistani government needs, and the military needs to fear, is that most of these people are now becoming Taliban sympathizers, because they then see Taliban as the only formidable force which is taking on the American military in Afghanistan and taking on the allying Pakistani military within the country.
Let me bring Maria Sultan in to respond to that point. Could this actually be a radicalising a lot of people who actually wouldn't necessarily support the Taliban otherwise?
I don't think so. I think, yes, you will have a portion of the people who would be affected and who would, of course, ultimately perhaps see the Taliban as sympathizers. But let's not forget the fact that it's almost been a year since the people have actually seen the political administration and the actual administrative control of the Taliban in areas where they were living. And it did not actually come about as the most representative or the most tolerant structure. And as Scofield has just talked about, the Pakistani culture is essentially based on Braillevi, ethic, and it's pretty tolerant. It's Sufic and it's tradition. So for people who are quite used to a tolerant understanding of religion, there had been a little or absolutely no room in terms of the interpretation of Islam and in terms of faith-oriented stuff, and most importantly, it had led into very strong punitive measures which were taken by the Taliban. So I think the Pakistani population, and most importantly people where these Talibans had traditionally had a stronghold, had also seen these people in action and also seen them in control, and therefore, despite the fact that this is not an easy operation for Pakistan or the Pakistani people, I think there seems to be more understanding for the operation, and perhaps people want to get rid of this phenomena which has plagued their areas and made everyday life very, very difficult for them.
Okay.
So I would disagree with this concept.
Okay, we're running out of time, so very briefly, Julian Schofield, how do you see this operation going? Quickly, or is it going to drag on for a long time?
Pakistan's never lost a counterinsurgency operation, primarily because they have lots of soldiers. It's a formidable military. They know the region. The problem, as my colleagues have mentioned, is it's the political consequences. It's really about bad governance. You have a essentially Punjabi-dominated army inflicting an aggressive, insensitive military campaign in a region that probably, if left on its own, the Taliban would have been forced to work out with the ulema and the religious peers and the mullahs. It probably would have died out on its own. By forcing this, they might drag it out.
Okay, on that note, I'm afraid we must leave it there. Very interesting discussion, and thank you very much indeed to all our guests. Maria Sultan in Islamabad, Salman Ahmed, and in Montreal, Julian Schofield. Thank you all very much indeed. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.